The measure of a human being is determined by who they place their faith in. Who do you believe in? Who do you trust? That is ultimately what determines how you're going to orient your life and which information you choose to assimilate in your consciousness and live by. The verse in Jeremiah reads, chapter 17, verse 5, "So said Yahweh, cursed is the man that believes in man, and places flesh as his strength, and from Yahweh he turns away his heart." Cursed is the man who believes in human power, who allows a lowly entity, just like himself, to dictate how he should live his life. Blessed is the man who puts his faith and his trust in God, because that is actually someone who can be trusted, and that is actually someone worth believing in, God himself, and no one else. It's very easy to identify a corrupt leader based off of this, because a true leader would want their followers to know God. They'd want to be there simply to fulfill their task as a servant of God. Because if God so happened to give them additional knowledge or additional blessings, their only job is to share that with others and to fulfill God's will for the world, which is that all souls should be enlightened and that everyone should have access to the truth. When looking through some of the great leaders and some of the great prophets, you find some very concerning remarks that they make, which really should make one question their validity altogether. Take Jesus, for example, the father of Christianity, the prophet and the Messiah for those who believe in him. He has this to say. John chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus said unto him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me." Now think about that for a second. No man comes to the Father, who is God, unless they go through Jesus, who is this man. And he's saying all of these grand things about his divinity. Yet in the process, he cuts off the individual from God, thereby placing his authority above even God himself. Now, what kind of leader would want that for their followers? Clearly, only someone who has a vested interest in power. And the same could be said for the rabbis in Judaism, known as the Pharisees or the scribes. The rabbis write in the Talmud, tractate Eruvin, page 21b, "My son, be aware and be careful with the words of the scribes, more than with the words of the Torah, because the words of the Torah have some positive commandments, some negative commandments, with all different consequences. However, the words of the scribes, the words of the rabbis, whoever transgresses the words of the rabbis is deserving of death." Now that's quite the statement, coming from a human being who is making laws on the basis of their own judgment, to claim that their own laws and their own judgment actually comes before God, before God's words. Because God's words, they got all these varying significance. But as we know, the words of the rabbis, if you transgress that, you're deserving of death. This strikes me as examples of leaders who really are not in it for the truth, of people who are not there to simply be servants of God and humbly convey God's word to others. Rather, they're in it for their own gain and for their own power and for their own ego. And anyone who has independent thought should be very careful when hearing people speak that way, when they have such a vested interest in the masses absorbing their ideas without any questions and believing that only through them can they actually come to understand God, and only through them can they actually have a chance at accessing the truth. This is not the way of a true shepherd of the people. This is not a way of someone who really understands his place in the divine picture. Unfortunately, this is the case with most religious leaders that you'll come across. Not only is this the case amongst religious leaders, but even secular leaders as well. Those who represent the universities and the sciences, they consider their discoveries to be unquestionable. They consider their analysis of the world and of life to be, without a doubt, the truth. And whoever were to question the great advances of science and the great achievements of the human mind is clearly a fool for denying just how far we've come with the great minds of the sciences and technologies and all of the varying pursuits of modern man. To contrast this attitude, I'd like to give you the example of Moses, because Moses is a very unique individual. Although he clearly has the capacity for immense greatness, that God himself calls Moses to be the leader and take the Jewish people out of slavery to the promised land, Moses initially does not even want to do it. He says, "Who am I to be worthy of this task?" And even when he takes it on himself and he goes through with it, at no point ever does Moses make it about himself. At no point does he say, "Obey me because I said." In fact, every verse in the Bible, whenever Moses is giving a commandment, it says, "And God spoke to Moses saying," command the Jewish people to do this, tell the Jewish people to do this. And so in this sense, Moses was only serving as a conduit and as a messenger between God and the people, simply as an intermediary, but not as the way to God. The way to God is to God. The way to God is the connection that the individual has to God, their dialogue that they have with God, their existence, which is a direct result of God's kindness. The purpose of someone to lead is simply up to God who he chooses. But the reality is that everyone is deserving of equal blessing and equal importance in terms of being judged for their right to divine wisdom and divine knowledge. This is clearly illustrated in the book of Numbers, where God comes and reveals himself to a number of the elders. And it says that there were two men in the camp who began to prophesy, named Eldad and Medad. And when Joshua, who was the disciple and student of Moses, heard that these men were prophesying in the camp, he came running to Moses and he said, "My master Moses, please lock them up. You must confine them. They're breaking the law here. They're not supposed to be prophesying. Prophecy is only for the greats. It's only for the select few." So clearly this is a big problem, that there are two regular individuals prophesying. And so this is Moses' response, and it reads like this. Numbers chapter 11, verse 29. "And Moses said to him, Are you being zealous for me? And who shall give if all the people of Yahweh were prophets? For Yahweh shall give his spirit upon them." Moses was not the slight bit fazed to hear that others were prophesying. In fact, he didn't consider it at all to be a problem. He considered it to be a great blessing that God's Spirit was resting upon people. In fact, if only God would give it to all the people, then that would be truly wonderful. This teaches us a fascinating thing, which is that people who actually have grace in their heart and people who actually want the good of others and the good of all, they're not selfish with their knowledge. They don't hold on to their wisdom locked up, only giving it to those who they deem worthy of hearing their wisdom. In fact, they recognize that the eternal wisdom that flows through them is simply a result of the source, and the source is God. Each and every one of us is a prophet in our own right. Each and every one of us has our own unique message to convey. Everyone is unique, and everyone's life experience is unbelievably complex. And so you just being yourself, you're bringing a revelation to the table. You're bringing something that we can now discover about God and His creation, that He made you and He brought you here and He put you in this family, in this environment, and gave you these experiences. And the truth is that it would be a marvelous thing if the Spirit of God can rest on everyone. And so there's no limitation when it comes to the enlightened. There's no limitation when it comes to those who want the good of God to be revealed unto all. There is no limitation. And for anyone to go ahead and claim that you need to follow them and you need to listen to them, and only through them can you access the truth, you're dealing with someone who's in it for their own gain, for their own power, for their own influence, for their own benefit, for their own financial gain. Because a true teacher and a true human being simply has love in their heart and the desire to share goodness with others, despite what they've been given and despite their privileges. They have no interest in withholding what they have to offer from others. If we all lived this way and we were all open with what we have to offer the world, and we all walked around with an open heart where we quite literally shared this life experience that we're having together, and we showed one another that we were sincere about what we were trying to give over, whether it's an idea or it's a helping hand or it's a piece of advice, everything counts and everything's of immeasurable significance. And unfortunately, when the people at the top attempt to rob everyone else of their influence and rob them of their uniqueness, we're dealing with masses who now don't even have the ability to think for themselves, who don't even have the ability to express themselves. And they're left wondering how they could possibly achieve the heights of those who are rich and famous, or those who are wise and insightful. But they don't realize that they have that within themselves, and they have that spirit within them in their own unique fashion, in their own sense of being, and how they were made by God. And that's perfectly beautiful and wonderful and powerful. And if people can access their spark and they can access their truth and what they have to bring to the table, I think we'd begin to flourish in a way that's unprecedented, because that is the potentiality of the human soul. That is the potentiality of this life. The limitations that are placed are done from such an evil attitude. They come from people who simply just want their own agenda furthered without the slightest care for all those who get left behind.